Science is really representative of a method. It's a method of knowing something. We refer to this as the scientific method. It's not the only way to know something, and it's not even necessarily the superior way to know things. Science doesn't do philosophy. Science doesn't do history. Science doesn't do theology. It leans on all of those other disciplines, but the method itself is limited. It cannot speak to those other areas. Well, if you grew up any time in the last few hundred years, you grew up sort of breathing the air of a movement called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment marked a significant shift in the way that people thought about knowledge and acquiring knowledge. There was a movement away from relying on God revealing himself as a foundation from knowledge towards this idea that humankind can reason their way upward to understand the world that we inhabit. And that's a broad characterization, but it has led over the centuries to a pretty profound question. And that is, can we really say that Christianity or the Christian faith is in conflict with science? Is it in conflict? Is there a conflict there between religious faith, specifically Christian faith, and science? And to answer that question, we've got to unpack this a little bit, because sometimes the question has some embedded assumptions that we need to bring to the forefront. So when I hear this kind of question from people, sometimes I'll ask, hey, let me ask you this. When you say the word science, what do you mean by that? What is science in the way that you're using it? And there's at least three ways that people will use that word. The first is they'll think of science as sort of a stand-in or a fill-in word to refer to naturalism. And naturalism is that worldview that says that all there is the machinery of the universe. We're all sort of machines, and we have material substance, and the machines are governed by processes, but there is no supernatural elements in the world. All there is are natural elements. Now, naturalism is fraught with problems. There's no doubt about that. To use a couple of examples here, naturalism can't explain something like objective and meaningful beauty. It can't explain something like morality in any grounded, objective sense. It can't explain something that I think we would all say is very important, and that is love. And this idea of the soul or the spirit, it can't explain those things because it wants to sort of reduce everything down to just sort of animalistic instinct. And so it can't explain some of the more important facets of being human. And so if you're asking me, does science conflict with Christianity? And what you mean by science is naturalism, the answer is yes, absolutely. That's absolutely the case. But not everyone means naturalism. Sometimes when people say science, what they really mean is sort of an institution of the scientific community. And so when we think of the scientific community, let's be clear, there's no book of science that we can go to and say, this is the definitive stance of all scientists who have ever lived. You know, everything is sort of up for grabs and disputed. But nevertheless, there are some scientific facts, we'll call them, that are ubiquitous. They appear everywhere. We all sort of agree on a baseline level that these represent truth. So for instance, the Earth, rotates on its axis, or the fall rate of gravity on Earth is 9.8 meters per second squared. These are scientific facts, boots on the ground. These are data that we can affirm. Now, the problem is, I think probably a number of people in our culture think that the extent of those undisputed facts are broader than they actually are. There's quite a bit of scientific theory that is still very much disputed in the scientific community. And so let's keep in mind, facts, data, has to be interpreted. There are narratives around the data in order to interpret, and that requires starting points, presuppositions, and assumptions. And so if you have a different starting point, you may come to the data and come away with a different conclusion than someone else that has a different starting point to narrate or to explain the data at hand. So this is why we have different scientific theories that try to explain the origin of the universe, for example. The origin of the universe, contemporary cosmologists will talk about the Big Bang cosmology or the multiverse theory, things like this. Well, of course, Christian scientists are perfectly well within their means to say, you know what? Genesis Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a legitimate offer that we have as Christians to bring into the discussion. And so there's no reason to discount that. Now, to be clear, there are some areas that are considered sort of settled, undisputed scientific theories that Christians would disagree with. And one of those that just we have to talk about here is the theory of evolution, or macroevolution as it's called. Here's what I want to say to that. Again, we've got to interpret the data that we have. And so if we bring different sets of assumptions and presuppositions into it, we may very well interpret the data that's available to us differently than our friends that have already accepted naturalism. And so that doesn't mean that Christians are divorced from the scientific community, those Christians that want to reject the theory of macroevolution, but it does mean that we represent a minority voice. Still, I don't think that that removes us from the scientific community, and I don't think necessarily we need to think of that as science being at odds with Christianity. We just come at this from a different perspective. The starting point is different as we interpret the data. And then thirdly, I think this is the best way to think of the word science. Science is really representative of a method. It's a method of knowing something. We refer to this as the scientific method. And so if you've gone through K-12 education, you've heard about this your whole life. What's the scientific method? Well, you come up with a hypothesis and you test that hypothesis with the available data. Now, there are a couple of things to be said about that method. It's a great method for knowing things. But let me just make a few points. Firstly, it's not the only way to know something, and it's not even necessarily the superior way to know things. Science doesn't do philosophy. Science doesn't do history. Science doesn't do theology. It leans on all of those other disciplines, but the method itself is limited. It cannot speak to those other areas. And so if I were to say, for instance, let's say someone were to say, science is the superior way to know things. The problem is, I can't prove that using the scientific method. I have to lean on philosophy or theology to prove that, and that illustrates my point. It becomes self-refuting. So it would seem, yes, science has limits. It's also limited by the fact that it's an inductive science. It's a science that doesn't, come away with logical absolute certainty. It comes away with probabilistic claims. It deals with plausibility. And so that presupposition and those assumptions that we bring to the table will inevitably change the calculus for what we find to be plausible. Now, let me make this point here. Science as a method works because our world is full of complexity. It works because our world is full of laws and order and structure. There's a sense of cause and effect. The scientific method works because things are repeatable in this ordered, rational world. It works because we have the cognitive faculties to interpret the world. So that begs the question, what kind of worldview can explain those realities? The Christian worldview says the world reflects the Creator. He is the first cause. He's the one that kicked all of this off and made us in His image. So if you're asking me, does science as a method conflict with Christianity or our faith? Not only does it not conflict, I think you have to have something like Christianity to explain why the scientific method works to begin with. So there's no conflict here.